Hello, Mr. Ash. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Hello, friends. This is 𝗔𝘀𝗵 𝗛𝗂𝗅. I'm a technical writer at the Cyber Express. Today, we have with us Mr. Ash Hunt, who is the Global Chief Information Security Officer at the Apex Group. He has worked with the UK government departments, Forbes organizations, and critical national infrastructure. He has also authored UK's first quantitative framework and actuarial model for information risk. He's been also a soldier at the British Army. I'm so excited to know about that. And he has worked at the United Nations as well. So, Ash, I am not usually very nervous talking to people, but I am right now. I'm nervous and I'm feeling really proud that I'm talking to someone who's done so many things, in such little time. I'll
Uh, I'm very grateful, but honestly, it just sounds impressive when you read it off. But I just like to keep busy, really. That's what it is.
It's amazing. Okay, so speaking about risk quantification, how do you think organizations will now model their cyber risk? What are your forecasts on how companies will be testing and validating against business assumptions?
So I think we have a real issue at the moment as a profession globally that the way we look at risk is completely backwards, and for some reason we've not really adopted a lot of the effective practices that have been used in almost every other industry sector, which is quite shocking when you think about it like that, given the critical importance of information and cybersecurity nowadays. And I think that's because we can operate quite like an echo chamber as a profession, and the sort of established schools of thought, the ISOs, the NISTs of the world, have almost boxed information security professionals into a fixed way of thinking, and that thinking is particularly around value-based subjective judgments, a kind of qualitative approach that relies on scoring things, either red, amber, greens, or giving sort of false labels to numbers, the 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, that kind of ordinal scoring, to try and measure complex risks that we face. And I think the profession is now sort of at a linchpin where we're beginning to think, is that measurement criteria, that methodology and framework actually appropriate and suitable for us, given the kind of complexity of the challenges that we face and indeed the risks that we face in technology? And the answer is definitely no. The amount of money year on year that's invested and expended on cybersecurity budgets in organizations globally is a reflection that no matter how much we're getting right, there's something that we're definitely not, there's something that we're definitely getting wrong. And that is all a byproduct of the way in which we calculate and measure risk. And it's forcing professionals to expend a lot of their cybersecurity investment in areas where they can't currently validate what that return from a security perspective is for them, or what that return looks like financially for the organization. Because the measurement criteria that we're using, like I mentioned before, can't give us that kind of insight and results. So we need to be moving to more stochastic methods, which sounds complex, but it's really just looking at using the kind of forecasting methods that we use in everyday life everywhere else. If you think about the way the weather's forecast, for example, or if you think about how we measure insurance policies, okay, they're all based on looking at the probability of events occurring, the likelihood of those events occurring, and looking at the extent of financial loss that's incurred each time. And those two principles are really what we need to be looking at. And that's all really we mean around risk quantification. It's trying to forecast what kind of bad things can happen to us, potentially, then looking at, out of all of those scenarios, which are the kind of scenarios that are more probable to occur than others. And based on those ones that are more probable to occur, what are the extents and ranges of loss that we could potentially face as a business as a result of those risks coming to fruition? And so there's lots of techniques that we can use for that. Monte Carlo analysis is one, where we're basically providing estimates to a model and simulating the sort of risk scenario thousands of times over to provide a distribution of outcomes. And that's really important as a tool and a mechanism for us, because risk isn't fixed. It's not static and it's not point in time. It changes continuously. So the most important underlying principle for us around how we need to measure risk moving forward is to have models that reflect uncertainty. And the problem with the kind of qualitative approaches at the moment is they force practitioners into making fixed but ultimately vague claims about a risk at a point in time, which is out of date the second the claim's made. What we need are living, breathing models that continuously reflect the changing variables of our risks, i.e. the risk landscape that we're facing. And the whole purpose of having those kinds of models is so that we can make smart investment decisions about the remediation actions that we want to take, and then to be able to validate how effective those remediation actions were, both again in terms of improving our security posture and improving the financial return for the organization. Which brings me, really to the whole premise of risk quantification and how companies will be measuring and testing their business assumptions moving forward can be summarized in the term decision management. All risk management is decision management. And at the moment, as a profession, we're broadly not in the space where we've got models where we can take real-time decisions that are justifiable and can be tested and repeated in a model. And that's absolutely what we need to be moving to with risk quantification, and what we need to achieve to help bring true business benefit out of our risk management programs and technology.
Great. That sounds really extensive and comprehensive. I'm really curious to know where something like this has been implemented.
Sure. I myself personally have implemented this at a number of global financial service organizations and banks. And I think I will caveat that, because there's a perception that risk quantification is very forward-leaning in financial services, but nowhere else. And that's a complete myth in technology. Yes, of course, financial service organizations are well leagues ahead in their client service arms and business arms around risk quantification, because those are the techniques that that kind of uncertainty modeling is exactly what financial service organizations, banking, asset management, etc., all use to calculate risk. But actually, when you look in the technology functions of those organizations, it's as far behind as it is in any other field. I say to people a lot of the time that the organizations who are most effective at risk management are small businesses, because they don't have the liquidity and capital to withstand bad events happening to them. Otherwise, they'll collapse as a business. So they get, even if they don't know it explicitly, they get very good very quickly into a rhythm of addressing the things that are really causing them harm. Whereas when you become an organization of a certain size, particularly some of the large scale enterprises I've worked that are multinational, you become so big that you begin to lose sight of some of the areas where you're actually losing money. But if you look to pharmaceuticals, if you look at the health sector with measuring the survival rate for drugs, if you look at the military, logistic modeling, for example, all of these industries have implemented these processes and practices. I say to people all the time, if you were going to invest money in a fund and someone was to tell you it's red or green 1 month, it wouldn't really be satisfactory to you, would it? Because you're looking for more detail, it's your own money. Now, if someone was able to tell you, well, it's going up by X percentage, down by X percentage because of these variables, that's the kind of insight that everyone expects when you're investing. We don't, for some reason, haven't had that kind of sort of demand and benchmark of quality in technology risk, and I think that is absolutely what's going to change moving forward. But there are plenty of examples. I think a really interesting one that I reel off quite a lot is NASA. So NASA actually run qualitative risk modeling based on the subject matter experts that they have working for them against quantitative models for every piece of activity that they do, shuttle launches, etc. And even though the people are world leaders in their field, have worked there for decades, they are beaten by the model every single time, because you can't, human beings, we're subject to cognitive biases, heuristics, and all these other issues that mean when we come to estimate, we're fallible. Whereas if we can build models that can be repeated and tested, we can calibrate those models over time to be more accurate and more precise about the problems we're trying to solve. So it's definitely industry agnostic.
Wow, that is really intense, and you're pretty sure about how it's going to work. So that's really amazing to learn. My next question is, Ash, how will security functions focus less on point solutions and more on platform, regarding attack breach simulations, extended detection and response, and cloud security posture management?
So I'm conscious I don't want to be sort of seen as a Cassandra in the sense of trying to predict things that are perhaps not going to be the case, even though I may feel they're true. I mean, from my perspective, you almost see this constant consolidation, devolution, reconsolidation going on in the vendor market when it comes to cybersecurity. It's very much a saturated market in many areas. There's a plethora of companies. The companies are extremely wealthy. There's huge amounts of money in the marketplace, and that can skew decision makers and end users like myself, as well as the entire global environment from which tools are actually the most effective. When you look at large-scale cloud providers now, like AWS and Microsoft, they have so much capability out of the box that you are almost encouraged to just consolidate around that one vendor and not to use other products. But of course, no one company does everything perfectly. And we have a lot of esoteric, really specific problems to solve in cybersecurity that sometimes need, these kind of specific solutions. But what I have noticed, and certainly this is a strategy that I'm pursuing and have been for a while, is I'm seeing a consolidation of capability around particular conceptual areas or conceptual problems that we are trying to fix. So if I look at some of the ones that you mentioned, cloud security posture management. So you could end up potentially with 10 to 20 different cloud security tools if you wanted to, each doing a different thing, but invariably there's overlap. I think what you're beginning to see in the marketplace now is the tooling capability to start wrapping around the concept of protecting your cloud environment in one go. So that might include a variety of services. It might include your web gateways. It might include your WAFs, your web application firewalls. It might include your CASB, your cloud access security breaker, whatever it might be. But you're beginning to see a kind of, and you're seeing this with what's called Secure Access Service Edge, SASE, a SASE architecture. It's basically a cloud-based security architecture moving forward. And that has the real potential to change the way businesses operate for the end users in the business, and not just be another random sort of security tool that we're operating in the back. Again, with attack breach simulation, we're now looking at trying to forecast, very much again in line with risk quantification, how attackers can actually get through and cause damage to our businesses. And so to have a capability which can help work out how attacks can happen, where we're going to be vulnerable, where our controls are going to perform effectively, that is taking multiple concepts and traditionally multiple tools and wrapping it around a single platform. And again, we've seen the same thing with XDR. It's no longer just about protecting and detecting things that are happening across our technology estate. It's about ensuring that we've got automated response actions being wrapped in there, because for analysts, we're never going to be everywhere at once, okay? And we need all of our technologies working for us, not vice versa. So we want platforms like XDR that can help understand user behavior over time, so that if we have malicious activity or even actually accidental activity, that we've got automated playbooks, use cases that can be deployed at a machine level immediately in real time to take the kind of necessary preventative action or indeed corrective action that we want to see. And so as I said, I think it's a really valuable thing and a good thing that the market is now not focusing as much on a plethora of point solutions, but it is beginning to focus its tooling capability and development around these conceptual problems that we're trying to solve as security leaders.
Great. Okay, that's amazing. Seeing the kind of attacks that's going on these days, it seems like it is the right approach to focus on one thing and build on it instead of looking at everything at once. So I agree with that.
Yeah.
How will qualitative subjective self-assessment of technology controls begin being replaced with automated controls that can be measured on a system level? How well will continuous control monitoring help in providing ongoing real-time analytics of risk mitigation?
So I talk about controls quite a lot because I'm interesting like that. They're almost the flip side of the risk piece, to the fact that actually I have a technology risk management and control capability, because they're almost two sides of the same coin, right? You know, anytime you're looking at risk, you're really actually concerned about the controls that will mitigate risk or reduce it to acceptable levels. And the same problem that's plaguing risk management in technology is the same one that's plaguing the control area as well. When we look at any of the lines of defense traditionally, or any audiences, when we look at measuring controls, for the 99% across the profession, it's done again, heavily qualitative, subjective. They're given colorful rankings, you know, highs, medium, lows. But of course, your high may be very different to my high. How do you prioritize remediation or control improvement activities when all of your controls are listed as low, you know, or high? It's impossible to then prioritize based on a vague criteria and yardstick, like we see at the moment with a lot of the subjective self-assessments that are being used for measuring our controls. And ultimately, I find it almost ironic. We spend colossal amounts of money in technology on our control environment, very advanced pieces of tech, and then we just want to guess how well they're doing. And yet we're sat on terabytes of useful analytical data and telemetry that can give us not only a guess, it can give us the empirical evidence of how those processes are performing on a continuous basis. So look, if I take an example, if you have your change management controls in ServiceNow, all you need to do is honestly plug an API in to a terminal, you know, use a robotics agent to pick out the data fields you need, wrap that into a metric and pull that data on a continuous basis. And you can measure how well the change controls perform in real time. I use that example because I've done it at one of the top 10 FSB banks globally. And it's not an easy exercise. It takes a while to get that going. But once you've got the process set up, the value is absolutely phenomenal. It changes culture. It changes the value, the return on investment for the business. It stops teams expending time on mundane guesswork tasks, which you can't possibly validate. And it also stops the inaccuracies that you're invariably going to experience with the kind of qualitative approaches. And it extracts all that value out of the existing investments that you've already made, which I personally think is a really encouraging thing. And the great thing about it is, because in my view, I think if a control's not automated, it's probably design ineffective, because it's going to be in part reliant on people, and everyone, myself included, is invariably exposed to making error at one time or another. So our systems, if they're configured improperly, but we can address that, okay, and we can identify very quickly, much quicker than we can in manual process breaks. And so what I think you will see moving forward is that as we begin to get true continuous controls monitoring operating effectively as a process in businesses, you'll be able to use that data in your risk analysis in real time to look at the increasing or decreasing levels of loss exposure in your business, which is fantastic, because it means you'll have, again, that living, breathing model that will say, here's how my control suites are performing on a continuous basis, and here are the loss scenarios, i.e. the risks that those controls are mapped to. I know if the controls dip below a certain threshold and my loss exposure increases, that means we need to take a remediation action. And because we know how much we spend on our controls, how much the technology of the control costs, how much it costs in terms of running it and operating it, looking after it and maintaining it, we know then in that model how much our loss exposure is increasing and decreasing, we can run very simple and very quick return on investment calculations to work out, actually, if the control is only going to reduce the risk by between 10 to 50,000, but the control costs 150,000 to implement, well, guess what? It's not worth our time and effort as a business. We would be better to stomach the 10 to 50 grand loss, potential loss. So I think that's the kind of decision analytics and insight that we need to be capturing as security professionals and security and technology risk teams moving forward to get the true value out of our controls.
Great. I'm just wondering, how long do you think will it take for big businesses to realize what you're saying?
Well, I've been saying it for over half a decade. And okay. People far more intelligent and successful than me have been saying it for even longer, which is back to my point at the head of our conversation, which is there is definitely a very interesting psychological study to be done on information security professionals and the profession as a whole as to why we have been so closeted in our mindset with regards to adopting best practice that sits outside of our profession. And I'll use another example, behavior change. I've been fortunate enough to have experience working in behavior change outside of information security, and the psychological work that we did in those programs around how you change people's behavior over time through process re-engineering, etc., really taught me more of what I do now in my training and behavior change program and portfolio than anything else. And yet that practice didn't come from information security. If I look at the problems around qualitative risk judgments and assessments, well, you look at the work of people like 𝗬𝗏𝗔𝗍𝗪 or Daniel Kahneman, psychologists and statisticians who have done huge studies into why people inherently are subject to cognitive biases and heuristics when they're assessing things. And that's why we can't rely on human mental models. We need more sophisticated models that we can help build and configure and calibrate, but we need to have them separated from our own mental models that we operate with. And so again, that's another great example where there's fields of practice that have been validated through scientific study and empirical evidence over decades. And yet we very much get locked into, well, if it's not in ISO, it's not good. And I think that's just a dangerous space for us to be in. I think there's so much value add to be captured from other practices to support cybersecurity and information security work that we should be doing it in anger.
Absolutely. Ash, how do you see the need for security leaders to be asked to validate the return on their security investments, either through quantitative improvement to the security posture or in terms of risk spend efficiencies?
Yeah, so I mean, I've touched on this already, but for me, I see my job as a CISO really as a revenue enablement officer for the business. My job is to help this business make as much money as possible and to be successful and grow and expand its opportunities in whichever direction the CEO and the board wish. And I do that obviously through security, and chiefly the way I do it, or the responsibility for my area to support that initiative, is to help prevent it from losing money in areas which it obviously doesn't want to. So i.e. preventing risk or mitigating it. And I think there's no notion of having zero risk. It doesn't exist. The business will inherently incur a level of risk with the activity it wants to conduct and to achieve its objectives. And my job is to work out how much, from a technology perspective, loss exposure we're generating in achieving those objectives, and what investment mechanisms can I put in place to reduce that loss exposure by as much as possible, so that when getting to that objective, the business is getting as much return back as possible. So the need is clear, in my view, absolutely clear. And I think the challenge we have had to date is cybersecurity, again, has not been able to do it or been very poor at doing it. When I look at this in the forms of board reporting, I see huge amounts of very complex security detail and technical detail being articulated to boards, when actually what we should be really articulating is, here are the couple of the top scenarios where we're currently exposed to huge amounts of loss, and here are some of the investment decisions that we could take to reduce those levels of loss, of those probable loss, and here's what you get back in return. Those are the kind of discussions where decisions can be taken as a result and action can be taken. And it also puts it in a language that everybody understands and speaks. It doesn't make it technical cyber technical babble or anything. It's talking about things in terms of probability or likelihood and financial loss, which everyone, particularly business leaders, understand. So I think the ask for it is clear. And again, that process, that kind of way of working gives us the ability not only to see the financial return on our investments, but also like how much improvement we're getting from a security perspective on our control investments, which is really important. So yeah, I think it's something we're desperately in need of.
Sure. What do you think will happen to policy prices when expensive cyber insurance policies are recalibrated to account for specific loss scenarios instead of each risk?
So I think cyber insurance is going through a kind of macro recalibration at the moment. So when we first saw policies being issued, they were relatively cheap. It was perceived to be a great mechanism for risk transfer, although it's not ever really transferring risk. It's more of a form of control, because basically what they'll do is offset some of the costs if you experienced an incident. But yeah, those policies were relatively limited, and that's largely because you were starting from a kind of blank slate, a tabula rasa, so to speak, for the global profession, because cyber insurance hadn't been offered before, and actuaries, brokers, etc., had little to no data to go on. Then what we started observing over the past couple of years, particularly with huge cases with some leading organizations as to whether or not they do or do not pay out under certain circumstances, is that policy prices now have dramatically increased. And they've done so because insurers have started witnessing organizations claiming lots more. It's a bit like your car insurance. If you hit your car, or someone crashes into it, or indeed in the former scenario, your car insurance is going to invariably go up. It's going to increase because to the insurer, they know you are more probable to do it again because it's happened once, and based on your type of behavior, and therefore they're going to make you pay a bit more to cover their losses. Okay, the exact same things happen in cybersecurity, and there's a couple of reasons. Well, I think really the core root cause of why the policies are now dramatically expensive is actually not to do so much with the need to claim constantly. It's to do with two issues. One, the scoping of specific scenarios that you need the insurer to cover, and two, data. So the first issue that's causing the price spike is that organizations are trying to think of and use their cyber insurance policy as a mechanism, as a blanket for covering everything. They say, we've got cyber insurance, we've got it up to a threshold of 10 million, let's say, and it doesn't matter if we have an incident, we're covered. Okay. Now to the insurer, they've got to then say to themselves, right, we need this much capital to cover off any of those events happening. But of course, there's 100 different types of incidents, if not more, that we could experience in information security. We could have a hurricane take down a data center. We could have someone accidentally leak emails to the wrong recipient. We could have someone maliciously inside the organization wanting to do damage. We could have someone maliciously, an adversary externally, that are wanting to cause damage. So when you extrapolate all of these scenarios, it's impossible for the insurer to cover that. Now, for them to get confidence how they can cover it, they obviously are going to have to charge a lot, right? And that's part of that generating a lot of the spike in policy pricing. Now, what organizations need to move to the approach of doing is to sit down and say, okay, here's all of our key loss scenarios for technology in the business, all of our key risks. Out of those, there are 5, just to say, for example, that we will never have enough capital to withstand internally in the business. So let's say, for example, it was a ransomware taking out the whole business for a week. we would never have enough money in the business to remediate that incident, either prevent it completely, which is not possible, or to withstand and offset all of the loss the business would suffer for being out of business for a week. So that would be a scenario where we would have to rely on an insurer to do so. The key thing is, though, the probability of having a ransomware attack that takes you out for a whole week is pretty low. It's a tail risk, right, for most organizations. I think most organizations think it's a very, very high risk. It's actually a tail risk when you look at the data, because it's infrequent. So it doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it causes a lot of damage. So to the insurer, they'll say, okay, that's fine. We think this is for you only a 1 in 20 year event. Okay, we recognize that we'd have to pay you 10 million if that did happen, but we acknowledge it's unlikely to happen. So here's your policy price. So that's one way of solving the spike issue, which is that we need to be very specific and choice about the kinds of scenarios we want an insurer to cover. If someone scratches your car, are you likely to claim on it? Not really, unless it's a really significant scratch. What you're more likely to do is to buff it out, or to go to Halfords and get some spray paint or something and cover it. Okay, that's because it costs you very little to do that, and yet to claim, the increase in the premiums basically will far outweigh the little cost it takes to buy that bit of paint or to buff the scratch out. Exactly the same principle here. The second issue with the spike rise has come from data, and this is back to the first series of questions that you asked me. At the moment, the way we measure risk is heavily subjective, qualitative, guesswork using colours and highs and lows, which, you know, are unreliable, inconsistent, etc., like I've said. Now, insurers are used to looking at things in terms of likelihood and outcome, damages, almost always financial, okay? Even in life insurance, health insurance, it might be car insurance, home insurance, whatever it might be. And what we're seeing as a challenge at the moment is that how on earth do you translate that kind of subjective, qualitative colours that we're measuring risk with in terms an insurer can understand? And that's where you're starting to see the break. So you're seeing companies like Security Scorecard, 𝗏𝗟, and others that are basically asking like due diligence questions of an organization. The insurer will ask you to use that kind of tool. They'll ask you those questions. The insurers will take those questions, those answers to those questions away, and we'll kind of craft your policy based on your responses. Like, do you have these controls in place? The trouble is, that is a completely unreliable mechanism. As someone who answers DDQs almost for a living, you know, you can have all of, and indeed and reviews them on behalf of the companies, you can have everything in place, but if you don't really know how those controls are operating in real time, and whether or not they're truly operationally effective, which is what dictates whether an incident or the risk happens or not, then, you know, saying you've got one of something doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. So the insurers are being forced into a kind of qualitative risk assessment process because of the way we capture our data at the moment. And that is what needs to change. And so you are slowly seeing, there are some fantastic groups out there like the 𝗍𝗔𝗍 Institute, where they're beginning to capture actuarial-based data. They're looking at the frequency of things happening and the extent of losses that are occurring each time. And those data points are extraordinarily valuable. They are like the loss tables that actuaries use in other arenas. Actually, interestingly, the model that I use for measuring risk and technology within 𝗏𝗡𝗥 was built between myself and a life insurance actuary for a major global insurance firm. So again, the principles are identical, but that is one of the ways to solve it. We need to be quantifying risk in the same language and terms, in the same models that insurers use, and then share that data between each other so that our policies can be priced accurately and reflect our true risk posture.
Right. Wow. You are like a book. You know everything from A to Z, which is amazing. So I'm curious to know, Ash, you have over decades of experience working with the United Kingdom government departments and the Financial Times Stock Exchange and the critical national infrastructure. So how are these security measures adopted in companies different from those, of their government counterparts?
Yes, you see a lot of challenges. I'd say most of the challenges are the same. You'd see the ways to address them differ quite a lot. Certainly, if you took public sector organizations like government departments or indeed national utilities, you'll often find budgets are much more constrained in those areas. And that's typical because they are there to generate service for the public and not to, how do I put this, create profit purely for shareholders, or if it is, it's the shareholders of the public body. It's not a financially motivated group in that sense. Now that does present real problems, right? Because it means you're constrained in terms of the technologies that you can buy. You're also constrained by the kind of process bureaucracy sometimes of being in the public sector. So the kind of level of scrutiny and diligence that governments need to place over certain products, only from certain providers perhaps, can be a real constraint on security teams. Having said that, there are also huge benefits to it. You're much closer to the heart of intelligence in the country. You'll have inherent relationships with intelligence agencies and defense agencies that can give you real insight into the challenges you're facing, and access where private sector organizations don't necessarily have that. You've also got to take into account that the threat landscapes are different. So, if you're working in the Ministry of Defence, your threat landscape is absolutely going to be nation state actors trying to penetrate sort of UK PLC, so to speak. Now, if you're a private sector organisation, it could still be true, but more often than not, it's going to be accidental behaviours that are going to cause mostly loss exposure and the odd sophisticated cyber attack, or in fact, actually in lots of cases, unsophisticated attacks. So, yes, you'll see shifting threat landscapes, and you'll see challenges around how we spend and invest our money with what we have, our budgets in information security. But broadly speaking, at the heart of it, the challenges are identical. It's building out a really effective sort of human risk culture where everyone understands what the common objective is. It's really being able to communicate and articulate the complexity of activity that we do in technology in risk-based terms to internal and external stakeholders. And that doesn't change across any of the industry sectors. That will always be true.
Right, amazing. I have now a fair glimpse of the difference. Thank you so much for that. Do you have any final predictions for the year 2023 in terms of changing security norms and how companies can be more cyber secure?
No, I usually hate these things because I'm always wrong. Or generic in the extreme, just to ensure that I'm right. I do think there will be. I think it's probably a summary of the points we've mentioned. I think you'll find more organisations, even if they're not moving to quantifying risk, they will be asking more scrutinous questions of their existing methodology and frameworks and asking more out of, is this really delivering for the business? I think that's going to happen. I think consolidation of technologies is definitely happening now. I think that will continue into 2023, but I think it will begin to shape around those kind of conceptual areas that I spoke about. And I think that's a good thing because the whole purpose of thinking about things in like an XDR way or an attack breach simulation way is that it's problem first. It's and problem focused. It's saying, okay, we're going to create a capability to solve a problem. And I think that's a really interesting way rather than this is a tool that does X, Y, Z. Because it's thinking of it in that kind of risk-based approach, which is obviously what I very much ascribe to. And I do think organizations will begin to get a bit of a better grip on what actually causes them loss rather than the obsession that can happen, particularly in media, around various different types of cyber activity. We are always going to have external adversaries hitting us. That's always going to be the case. But I think where information security functions are beginning to move to is understand, actually, when I'm trying to do all these things to fix those risks, I'm having to expend my people's time. That means their overhead costs and overhead for all of that time that they're working on trying to prevent risk from happening. Or indeed, if the risk does happen, how much time is it taking them to respond to it? How much time is it taking them to fix the risk? You know, how much extent of reputational damage might we experience? Are we losing any competitive advantage by our cybersecurity posture? What's the kind of horizon going to look like for legal and regulatory fines? So I think really trying to attribute where the business is actually losing money, I think is going to be a really key focal point for information security moving forward, because it will switch us from being perceived as a cost-taking function to a revenue-generating function. And yes, okay, we will never be a direct revenue-generating function, but we can absolutely be an indirect revenue-generating function in businesses, and that is where we need to move to. And I think we'll make those steps, or begin to make those steps as a profession in 2023.
Hopefully we'll get there sooner. Ash, I'm sorry, I forgot to congratulate you for becoming the CISO of 𝗥𝗚𝗍 Group. So congratulations.
Thank you.
While drafting the UK's first quantitative framework and model for information risk, what was your priority then, and what are your goals as the global CISO at the 𝗥𝗚𝗍 Group?
Actually, I suppose interestingly, the goal and the objectives are one and the same. Fortunately, I was working for the Information Security Forum, the ISF at that time, which was a fantastic opportunity to work in research and to step back from end user roles to understand why do we do things in a certain way in information security, and to make potential changes. And I think, for me, so I was very familiar with the FAIR methodology at the time that had been published in the US, which was very much sort of the first quantitative framework globally for technology risk. And I remember reading a book called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk by Douglas Hubbard, and it changed my entire career almost overnight. I couldn't put the book down. It's not a hugely long book, but it dramatically transformed my outlook on why do we do anything that we do in technology. And it's all about driving business opportunity and growth. And particularly the mechanisms through which we do that is preventing, detecting, or correcting bad stuff that's going to happen. And that was then that was what was underpinning then my kind of objective with the framework, was to say, how can I build something that at that time the ISF members, but also more broadly the global profession, could pick up and utilize and run quantitative analysis in a way that again provided those useful business outcomes. I think I also was really conscious that I wanted to achieve a framework that transitioned people from qualitative, subjective-based approaches to using more sophisticated stochastic models. And that's quite hard. I mean, I've got no maths background. I've got a B in GCSE, so I'm by no means the smart, or even remotely even smart around understanding sophisticated principles in mathematics or statistics. But so if I can grasp it, everyone can grasp it. I promise anyone that. And I think that was for me was then, okay, if I can understand it, why is 99% of people not using this? And so I became much more interested in the psychology around risk and saying, how can I transition people and get them to use an operational framework that brings a more sophisticated form of practice to their risk management discipline in technology? And really, that's absolutely a similar objective I have at 𝗥𝗚𝗍. I mean, my goal at 𝗥𝗚𝗍 is really renewing or building afresh a target operating model for security that supports 𝗥𝗚𝗍's growth well into the future, but more importantly, positions it as one of the leading global information security functions in financial services and beyond, and to ensure that it is supporting the business in every step of its own growth journey. For me, that looks like building out really robust automated identity and privileged access management across the global estate. I'm currently going through an exercise of building, not for my first time, but certainly my first time in 𝗥𝗚𝗍, an internal security operations center globally. So having regional SOCs that are supporting the business areas in those geographical locations. building out a technology risk and control architecture capability. And this for me is really important because it's almost a net new capability at Apex, which is fantastic because it means we can operate in a space where we're building from best-in-class ideas. So we are inculcating the whole business with the notion, at least as it pertains to technology risk, around risk analytics, modeling, decision management, and getting people into the habit of thinking around risk scenarios and loss exposure and how we can use smart control investment to address those. And also looking at control automation as well. I'm also building out a cloud security engineering capability that will really furnish the business with a kind of practical set of skilled security engineers to ensure all of our estate is hardened and tightened as we need it to be. And then finally, also technology assurance. So this is looking after all of technology governance and third-party assurance and information security officers for the business. So I think one of the really interesting goals is, given that I've been tasked with a number of areas of responsibility that sit across the whole of technology horizontally, rather than just your typical cybersecurity function, is how can I work with stakeholders and colleagues, not only in a collegiate fashion across technology, but also across the entirety of the business to build out those effective practices and ensure that they are serving the business. So it's going, I would like to think, very successfully so far. It's been very exciting and a really positive journey. And there's definitely a really positive reaction to that kind of approach for information security in the business, which is something I'm really pleased to see.
Amazing. I wish you all the success, Ash, in every endeavor that you delve into. And I hope you talk with us again after your training is done. And we can discuss more. If you write a book, I'll probably be the first person who will be reading it because you put it in such a systematic manner. Like you said, you have not much experience with, you're not much into maths, and so you can understand it, anybody can understand it. I also feel it resonate with everything that you're saying. So thank you for spending time with us and explaining so many things. I am more aware right now than I was like half an hour ago. So thank you again for talking to us.
Excellent. My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.